overdue finding cements 2009's place in history as the year when the United States government began seriously addressing the challenge of greenhouse gas pollution and seizing the opportunity of clean energy reform.
This bureaucratic nightmare is based on flawed science. Lisa Jackson, who is Obama's EPA administrator, admitted to me publicly that the EPA based its action today on the findings of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's known as the IPCC.
And, of course, Senator Inhofe then points to the emails that have circulated, now called Climategate, surrounding the IPCC data. The issue today, the EPA has finalized its finding that greenhouse gases are a threat to public health and thereby can be regulated under the Clean Air Act, according to a Supreme Court ruling. So what about this and how it changes the whole dynamic? Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. Juan Williams, news analyst for National Public Radio, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Steve.
Well, I think it's hard to overstate how important the EPA ruling is today. It really gives the EPA and the executive branch free rein to do just about anything, to regulate just about any aspect of U.S. commerce, given how much of manufacturing, automakers, what have you, emit greenhouse gases.
So even though the climate change legislation on Capitol Hill looks like it's stalled right now,
it's a backdoor. Yeah, this is a backdoor. It's a way to get to the same result potentially by using the mechanisms of the executive branch. I think to have the timing that this happened on the eve of the Copenhagen conference, I think the White House would like everybody to believe that that was sheer coincidence. I think the timing suggests otherwise.
Juan.
Well, the fact is that the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that the congressional action on the Clean Air Act includes things like greenhouse gases. So now you have Lisa Jackson, the EPA administrator, stepping up and saying, yes, we think, based on the scientific evidence, that CO2 gases, greenhouse gases, do fit this definition, and therefore it puts her in position, for example, in specific, to work with the Department of Transportation on limits emissions coming from these new light trucks that are being put out in the country. And about 23%, I think it is, of all greenhouse gases produced in the U.S. come from vehicles, on road. And so it puts the EPA in position to deal with that. Now, I think if you wanted to be critical of this, you would say, look, you know what, it's a time of high unemployment, we're in a recession, you don't want some kind of administrator in Washington putting the kibosh on any kind of new innovation or just, plain old industry. But the fact is, the economy has to change. We have to go towards green jobs. We have to do something about global warming. And the politics of it is, as Steve just pointed out, it helps the Obama administration. It helps with what's going on in Copenhagen. But it doesn't have much effect on the Congress. The Congress remains the place, the theater for real action. If there's ever going to be any action, it's going to come on cap and trade. And that's where the deal is. Well,
it was largely thought that this move would be essentially hold over the heads of Capitol Hill to say either move forward on cap and trade legislation or we're going to move forward on regulatory moves like this. Charles, this is the first step, but it could continue.
Look, it's blackmail, a way of saying to Congress, either you do cap and trade or we're going to do cap, no trade. We're going to regulate every aspect of American life. This is. If the EPA now has in its power, and perhaps it will enact it over time, to intrude into every aspect of American life. I mean, essentially what it can do is to regulate emissions from any institution, any enterprise, any apartment block that emits more than 250 tons of CO2 in a year, which is a very low level. It says it's going to raise that much higher, but it doesn't have the authority to actually raise it. So it can regulate every aspect of American life. It really is what Václav Klaus, the president of the Czech Republic, said. This is environmentalism is a new socialism, as a way for the feds, for the best and the brightest in the federal government to regulate all aspects of life. It used to be in the name of socialism, which was social equality. Now it's in the name of the planet. It's a smart strategy on the part of the left, but it is a hell of a way to do it. If you want to do it, at least you do it by the consensus of Congress. If you do it by regulation, there is going to be a revolution on the administration's hands.
Senator Inhofe and others, Steve, say this opens the doors to a lot of lawsuits. And primary of those lawsuits would be, what is the decision based on? And he claims that the EPA Administrator Jackson said that it was based on the IPCC data, which came from, among other places, East Anglia University, which is the center of the Climategate email controversy.
Yeah, it's not just a James Inhofe claim. It is indisputable that the data that the EPA is used on comes via the IPCC from East Anglia, and that's what I think is crucial here. Look, it is absolutely essential for the people who are proponents of climate change, dramatic climate change action, that there be no questions about the science behind it. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense at all to do to take the kinds of drastic measures that they're proposing. The fact is, there are questions about the science. You don't need to be a climate change denier to be a climate change skeptic. And the questions were raised by the scientists themselves, the most vocal and outspoken and dogmatic proponents of climate change in the world at East Anglia are the very people who are raising questions and saying, look, we can't explain the cooling trends over the past decade. That's a travesty. So when you've got the world's premier scientists on this issue raising these questions in private, it undermines all of their certainty, the certainty that they project when they make their public arguments.
I don't think so at all. Wait a second. There's one thing to say that you are saying we don't want to put out this data because it will feed our critics or people who don't believe that global warming is taking place. There's a difference between saying that and saying, oh, you know what, global warming is a fraud, and we want to perpetrate a fraud on the American people, and these people are not.
There is a difference, and it's a difference that I made.
Well,
I drew exactly that distinction.
You can be a skeptic. You say.
I drew exactly that distinction. The email was, we can't explain the cooling trend over the past decade.
They didn't want to put that information out and open it to lots of discussion.
Why couldn't you have discussion about it? It's science.
Fine, I agree.
Have the debate.
That's what they should do, Steve. I couldn't agree with you more. But it's important, I think, for everyone to understand, at no point did they say that there's any evidence that global warming is not occurring.
They didn't say that. The other thing that they said, though, was that they were going to manipulate the data.
It's not just a manipulation of data and a suppression of data. It's a suppression of dissent, and that's all over the
I agree with you.
It's about penalizing an editor who dared have an article.
Fine, but Charles, is there any evidence that there's anything but global warming taking place, and that as responsible leaders that we should take some action?
There's a huge amount of contrary evidence, and the problem is that there are active elements of suppression in this, and that raises a question as to whether you can trust what is called a consensus, which is a forced consensus of suppression, boycotting, and of scapegoating people who are dissenters.
I'm going to have to suppress this panel, but Juan, it's good to have you back.